The iris slammed shut with a sound like thunder buried in steel, and for 0.4 seconds, every sensor in Stargate Command registered nothing but static. Then the wormhole convulsed. It wasn't a normal kawoosh, the unstable vortex that flared every time a new connection established. This was something deeper, something that made the event horizon ripple like liquid metal, being struck from the other side by a force that had no business existing in any physics equation Carter had ever written. Alarms cascaded through the control room. Sergeant Harriman's voice cut through the noise with practiced calm. Unscheduled off-world activation. We have no IDC. Repeat, no IDC. General Hammond gripped the railing and looked down at the gate room through the blast-resistant window. The iris was engaged. Whatever came through would hit titanium at molecular velocity and be unmade. Except something was already through. It had come in during the 0.4 seconds, the gap between wormhole establishment and iris deployment. A fraction of time that no one in the room had ever seen exploited. And what had come through was not human. Not entirely. He stood in the gate room like a monument carved from war itself. Armor that looked grown rather than manufactured. Dark, segmented, slick with something that steamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. A helmet with no visible eye slit, no comm interface, nothing that suggested the man inside wanted to be seen or understood. In one hand, a weapon that Carter would spend the next 48 hours trying to classify. In the other, a sword that looked like it had been pulled from somewhere that didn't want to let it go. Behind him, the wormhole flickered once more, and a burst of something came through. Not matter, not energy. Something between. It splattered against the closed iris and dissolved with a hiss that left residue on the titanium that Sergeant Harriman would later confirm was not from any known element in the periodic table. Then the wormhole shut down. Chevron by chevron, the connection collapsed. Silence. The man in the gate room did not move. Did not look up at the blast window. Did not acknowledge the 4 armed guards who had dropped to tactical positions the moment he materialized. He simply stood, chest rising and falling with the breathing of someone who had been running, or fighting, or both, and waited. Not patiently, not submissively. He waited the way a predator waits when it has already decided there is nothing in the room worth killing. Hammond's voice was steady. It always was. Gate room, stand down. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage until we know what we are dealing with. O'Neill was already on his feet in the briefing room 2 floors up, jacket half on, coffee forgotten. Carter was pulling up the sensor logs on a tablet, her face cycling through confusion, and then something rarer. Genuine uncertainty. Daniel was mouthing a word that no one heard. Teal'c stood at the window, arms folded, watching the armored figure below with an expression that was not fear. It was recognition. If you want to see more characters cross over into different universes, you hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Indeed, the next 30 minutes would determine whether Stargate Command had just welcomed an ally or admitted something that would end them. Hammond reached for the phone. O'Neill reached for his P90. And in the gate room, the Doomslayer tilted his head, just slightly, toward the blast window, as though he could hear every word being spoken above him, and was already deciding which of them mattered. The containment protocol for an unidentified extraterrestrial entity arriving through an unscheduled gate activation was, on paper, straightforward. Armed escort, medical isolation, debriefing under controlled conditions. Hammond had overseen dozens of these situations. Goa'uld infiltrators, replicator scouts, Tok'ra agents arriving unannounced with intelligence that couldn't wait for proper channels. Each time, the protocol held. Each time, the situation resolved itself within the rigid framework that kept Cheyenne Mountain functioning. This was not one of those times. The 4 guards who attempted to establish a perimeter around the figure in the gate room made it exactly 11 seconds before the Doomslayer moved. Not aggressively. Not in any way that would have justified opening fire. He simply shifted his weight, turned his helmeted head toward the closest soldier, and held out one gauntleted hand, palm open, fingers spread. The universal gesture for stop. Except when he did it, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The closest guard, a sergeant with 6 years of off-world experience and nerves like piano wire, took a step back without deciding to. Something in the electromagnetic readings spiked. Carter, watching from the control room, saw it happen on 3 separate instruments simultaneously and felt the hair on her arms stand up. Hammond made the call. "Stand down. All personnel, stand down. Nobody touches him." O'Neill arrived in the gate room 4 minutes later. P-90 slung across his chest more out of habit than tactical necessity. He took one look at the armored figure, took one look at the residue still dissolving on the iris, and said, "Yeah, so, new guy?" The Doomslayer did not respond. O'Neill had interrogated Goa'uld. He had stared down System Lords, Replicator Queens, and one particularly unpleasant experience with a U-origin, ascended being that he still refused to discuss in detail. He knew how to read a room. And what he read in the gate room was not hostility. It was assessment. The figure was cataloging everything. The guards, the weapons, the blast window, the iris mechanism, the door, the distance to every exit. Not planning an attack, planning an escape route, just in case. "All right," O'Neill said, lowering his weapon to his side. Not dropping it, never dropping it, but making the gesture clear. "Here's how this works. You came through our gate, our house, our rules. I'm Colonel Jack O'Neill. You're currently about 40 feet below a mountain in Colorado, which is on a planet called Earth, which you may or may not already know about depending on where exactly you came from." He paused. "So, where exactly did you come from?" Silence. O'Neill waited. The Doomslayer's helmet turned toward him. A slow, deliberate movement that carried the weight of genuine attention. But no words came. No gesture of communication. No attempt to bridge the gap. Just the faint, mechanical hum of whatever powered that armor, and the breathing underneath it. Steady, controlled, the rhythm of a soldier who had been at war for so long that rest was a concept he no longer recognized. "Tough crowd," O'Neill muttered. Carter's voice came through his earpiece. "Sir, the energy readings from his suit are unlike anything in our database. It's not Naquata. It's not ancient. It's not anything we've ever cataloged. Whatever is powering that armor, it's—" She hesitated. Carter almost never hesitated. "It's alive, sir. The energy signature has biological markers." O'Neill processed that in about 2 seconds. "Alive. The armor is alive. The energy source is. The armor itself may be inorganic, but it's drawing power from something organic. Something with a lot of it." Daniel's voice joined the channel, quieter, more careful. "Jack, the residue on the iris. I just got preliminary analysis back from the lab. The molecular structure doesn't match anything terrestrial or any off-world sample we have on file, but the base composition shares trace similarities with biological tissue, heavily mutated biological tissue. So he's bleeding something on our door." "Not him. Whatever came through with him." Hammond's voice cut through, calm and commanding. "Yance G1, escort our visitor to medical. Dr. Fraser needs to get a read on him. Non-invasive. I want to know what we're dealing with before we do anything else." A pause. "Colonel O'Neill, do not provoke him." O'Neill looked at the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer looked back. Or at least the helmet faced him. There was no way to know what was happening behind that visor. "Wouldn't dream of it, sir," O'Neill said. Getting the Doomslayer to medical took 22 minutes, a combination of O'Neill's particular brand of stubborn patience and Teal'c's quiet, wordless presence at the perimeter. The Jaffa had said nothing since entering the gate room, but he walked beside the armored figure with a deliberateness that was not escort protocol. It was something older. It's something one warrior does for another when the situation has not yet been decided. Teal carried no weapon. He did not need to. The Doomslayer noticed. His helmet turned toward the Jaffa once, a brief acknowledgement, and then forward again, toward the corridor, toward whatever came next. Hammond watched them go on the security feed and allowed himself one thought before the briefing began. This was not a soldier who had come through their gate by accident. The medical base scans took 40 minutes and produced results that made Dr. Fraser call Carter down from the control room 3 separate times. The first call was about the energy readings. The second was about the biological anomalies. The third was about the fact that the Doomslayer had not removed his helmet, had not sat down, had not allowed any physical contact whatsoever, and had simply stood in the center of the examination room with his arms at his sides while every sensor in the infirmary tried to make sense of him and failed. Fraser had seen soldiers who refused cooperation. She had seen Goa'uld hosts pretending to be human. She had seen Teal'c in the early days, guarded, watchful, every muscle coiled. This was different. This was a man who had spent so long in combat that the concept of a safe room simply did not compute. His body was ready to fight. It would always be ready to fight. The pause between battles was just the space where he decided which enemy came next. Carter stood beside Fraser, studying the holographic display of the energy readings, and shook her head slowly. This doesn't make sense. The power output alone. It's orders of magnitude beyond anything we've seen from Goa'uld or ancient tech. And it's not technological. It's biological, like I said. But it's not his biology. It's something he's carrying. Something attached to him at a molecular level. Hell, the Doomslayer said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Both women turned. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was rough. Not from disuse, but from something deeper. And from years of a throat that had been screaming into the void and had long since stopped bothering with volume. Fraser blinked. I'm sorry? The energy. It's from hell. Carter's mind moved fast. Faster than most people gave her credit for, and most people severely underestimated Samantha Carter. You're saying there's a dimension, a physical, accessible dimension, that produces this kind of energy output, and you've been drawing on it as a power source. The helmet turned toward her. A nod. One movement. Precise. And the residue on the iris, Carter continued, the pieces assembling themselves with the speed of someone who had reverse-engineered Goa'uld mothership engines in a weekend. That wasn't you. That was something that came through the gate behind you. Another nod. Saw something from hell. The Doomslayer was silent for a long moment. Then, they followed. Hammond had the briefing room assembled within the hour. O'Neill, Carter, Daniel, Teal'c, Fraser, and a rotating cast of SGC analysts cycled through the data as Carter laid it out with the kind of brutal clarity that made her the best astrophysicist in the program. The Doomslayer sat at the end of the table, the chair creaking under the weight of his armor, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The sensor logs spoke for him. During the gate activation that had brought him through, SGC's long-range monitoring array had detected anomalous energy signatures on 14 different gate-connected worlds. Faint, barely above background noise, but consistent. The same biological energy signature that Carter had identified in the Doomslayer's armor, and the same signature as the residue on the iris. 14 worlds. 14 potential breach points. So we've got demons, O'Neill said, leaning back in his chair with the particular expression he wore when the situation had moved beyond absurd and into something he hadn't yet found the right sarcastic response for. Actual demons. Not Goa'uld pretending to be gods. Not Ori using worship as a battery. Actual, honest-to-God demons bleeding into our gate network. The terminology is irrelevant, Carter said. What matters is the energy. Whatever these entities are, they operate on a dimensional frequency that the Stargate can interact with. The gate doesn't discriminate between dimensions. It connects points in space. If hell is a point in space, even an adjacent one, the gate can reach it. Daniel leaned forward. Or something from hell can reach us. He turned to the Doomslayer. The archaeologist had been quiet through most of the briefing, unusual for him. But now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades translating dead languages and had learned that sometimes the most important conversation was the one where one side barely spoke. You've been fighting these things. For how long? The Doomslayer looked at Daniel Jackson for a long moment. Then he said a single word. Always. The briefing room absorbed that. Teal'c, who had been standing at the back with his arms crossed, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. O'Neill caught it. He always caught Teal'c's micro-movements and filed it away. The Jaffa understood something in that word that the rest of them didn't. Something about a war that had no beginning and no end. Something about what it cost to fight one. Hammond made the decision that afternoon. A MALP would be sent to the closest of the 14 flagged worlds, P3X-774, a planet they had visited twice before, both times without incident. If the demonic energy signatures were genuine, the MALP would confirm it. If they were sensor ghosts or interference from the Slayer's presence, they would know that too. The MALP lasted 9 minutes on P3X-774 before the feed cut to static. The last image it transmitted was a landscape that had been green and temperate on their last visit. It was now something else entirely. Something dark and wet and wrong, lit by a red glow that pulsed with the same biological frequency Carter had been tracking since the Doomslayer walked off the gate ramp. The room went quiet. The Doomslayer stood up. He walked to the display screen, looked at the image of P3X-774, and turned back to Hammond with his helmet tilted slightly, the closest thing to an expression the armor could convey. He was waiting for permission to do what he already knew he was going to do. The briefing on tactical insertion lasted 40 minutes. The argument about whether to bring the Doomslayer at all lasted 38 of them. O'Neill made the case with the blunt pragmatism that had kept him alive through more off-world missions than almost anyone in the program. We send a MALP. It gets eaten in 9 minutes. We send SG-1 without him. We're walking into something none of us have ever fought before, with weapons that may or may not work against it, on a world that was fine last Tuesday. He's the only one in this mountain who has fought these things and is still breathing. You put that guy on the bench, you're gambling with my team's lives on pride. Hammond listened. Hammond always listened before he decided. And if he doesn't follow orders, Colonel? Sir, with respect, he hasn't followed an order yet. He's also the reason those things haven't come through the gate again. Whatever he is, wherever he came from, he's a weapon pointed at exactly the problem we just discovered. I'd rather have that weapon on my team than standing in the gate room wondering what he's going to do next. Carter ran the numbers. Teal said simply, he is a warrior. Warriors are most dangerous when they are idle. Daniel argued for caution and was overruled, not because his concerns weren't valid, they always were, but because the situation had moved past the point where caution was a luxury. The Doomslayer was given no briefing package, no tactical map, no rules of engagement document. O'Neill tried anyway, spreading the topographical scans of P3X-774 across the table in the armory while the team geared up. The Doomslayer glanced at the maps once, absorbed them in a way that suggested he was filing every elevation, tree line, and kill zone into a mental database that had been running for longer than any of them had been alive, and then picked up the BFG 9000 from where it had been laid out on the weapons table like an artifact being cataloged. Carter watched him check the weapon with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. That thing, the BFG, what's the ammunition source? The Doomslayer held it up slightly, tilted it. A faint green glow pulsed from a chamber near the barrel. Organic, luminous, unmistakably alive. Hell, he said. Carter nodded slowly, already composing the questions she would ask later. If there was a later. The gate room sequence was different this time. No alarms, no containment protocols. Use chevron after chevron locked with the familiar mechanical precision that had become the heartbeat of Earth's defense, the kawoosh of the wormhole establishing with the shimmer that never quite stopped being extraordinary no matter how many times you watched it. O'Neill went through first, P90 up, the way he always did. Carter second, tablet running passive scans. Daniel third, linguistic scanner active. If the entities could be communicated with, he would find out. Teal'c fourth, staff weapon traded for a Zatniktel and a P90 of his own. The Doomslayer went last. He stepped through the event horizon without breaking stride. No hesitation. No pause. The way someone walks through a door they have walked through 1,000 times before, even if this particular door led somewhere none of them had ever been. EP3X-774 hit them like a physical weight. The atmosphere was wrong first. Not toxic. Carter's scanner confirmed breathable air, standard nitrogen-oxygen mix. But heavy. thick in a way that had nothing to do with humidity and everything to do with the energy saturating it. The red glow O'Neill had seen on the MALP feed was everywhere now, pulsing from the ground itself, from the trees that had gone black and leafless, from the sky where clouds churned in patterns that moved with purpose. The air tasted like copper and ozone and something else. Something that made the Naquada in Teal'c's blood sing, with a warning he couldn't name. "Well," O'Neill said, scanning the tree line with his weapon up. "This is new." They heard them before they saw them. A sound like tearing metal and wet breathing combined. A chorus of it, coming from the forest ahead, layered and overlapping in a way that suggested numbers. A lot of numbers. Teal'c's hand tightened on his P90. Carter's scanner spiked. Daniel looked at the readings and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the data telling him something he didn't want to believe about the density of what was out there. The Doomslayer moved. He didn't wait for a tactical call. Didn't wait for O'Neill's signal. He simply moved. Forward. Into the tree line. Into the sound and the dark and the red-lit horror of it. With a speed and certainty that stopped SG-1 cold for exactly 1 second. 1 second in which O'Neill watched a man walk toward something monstrous the way most people walk toward breakfast. Calm. Purposeful. Inevitable. "Contact!" Carter shouted. And then they were all moving. The first demon broke through the tree line 8 seconds later. O'Neill had seen a lot of things come through alien forests. Goa'uld creatures bred for hunting, Iratus bugs, wraith drones. Nothing had prepared him for this. A thing that was almost humanoid but wrong in every proportion, covered in the same dark wet substance that coated the landscape, moving with a speed that P90 rounds should have stopped and didn't. He fired. The rounds hit. The creature barely slowed. Then the Doomslayer was among them. What happened next lasted 45 seconds. O'Neill would later describe it to Hammond as the most efficient act of violence he had ever witnessed in 30 years of military service, and Jack O'Neill had witnessed a great deal of violence. Although the Doomslayer moved through the demons like water through cracks in stone, fluid, relentless, finding every weakness before it existed. The crucible sang as it cut. Each kill was precise. Each movement fed into the next, and with every demon that fell, the light in his armor flared brighter. The glory kill feeding him, restoring him, turning the enemy's death into his continued existence. The demons stopped coming after the 11th wave. The Doomslayer stood in the clearing, chest heaving, the crucible dripping something that steamed where it hit the corrupted ground. He turned back toward SG-1. The helmet regarded them for a moment. Then he pointed deeper into the forest, toward the source of the red glow. O'Neill looked at Carter. Carter looked at Teal'c. Teal'c looked at the Doomslayer and, for the first time since the gate room, spoke directly to him. Indeed, the after-action report on P3X-774 ran to 47 pages. Carter wrote most of it. The section on the Doomslayer's combat performance alone took 6 pages, and she had to revise it 3 times because the initial draft read like a fiction writer describing a myth rather than a scientist documenting observed events. Hammond read it in its entirety, twice, before calling the briefing that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. The source of the red glow on P3X-774 was a rift, not a geological formation, not a dimensional anomaly in any framework SGC had previously catalogued. Carter's scans described it as a tear in the fabric between dimensions, a wound in space-time that bled hell's energy into the local atmosphere the way a punctured vein bled into surrounding tissue. The Doomslayer had closed it, and O'Neill hadn't seen how the final confrontation with the entity guarding the rift had been fast and brutal and half hidden by the corrupted terrain. But when SG-1 reached the clearing where the rift had been, it was gone. Sealed. The ground where it had existed was scarred and dark, but the bleeding had stopped. 14 worlds, 14 rifts, 1 closed. Hammond stood at the head of the briefing table with the kind of stillness that meant he was thinking harder than he let on. So we have a dimensional incursion across the gate network, a hostile entity type that our standard weapons are ineffective against, and one combatant who can close the rifts, but hasn't told us how. Correct, sir, Carter said. And the gold? The room shifted. Onto the question hung in the air with the weight of something everyone had been thinking but no one had said out loud. Because the answer was obvious, and obvious answers in the Stargate program were usually the most dangerous ones. O'Neill said it first. They know. He was right. They knew within 72 hours. The intelligence came through the Tok'ra, as it usually did, fragmented, cautious, filtered through layers of operatives who trusted no one and shared information only when the alternative was worse. Selmak, blended with Jacob Carter, delivered the report personally, requesting a secure meeting with Hammond that excluded everyone except O'Neill and Carter. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Hammond's face carried the particular expression that O'Neill had learned to associate with the moment a situation stopped being complicated and became genuinely dangerous. Anubis had detected the energy signatures. Not through conventional Goa'uld intelligence. No spy network, no Jaffa scouts, no stolen data. Anubis had felt it. The half-ascended System Lord, who had touched the higher planes of existence and come back changed in ways that made the other System Lords fear him, had sensed the dimensional bleed across the gate network, the way a man might feel a change in atmospheric pressure. He recognized it for what it was. Something ancient. Something that predated the ancients themselves. Something that, if harnessed, could give him power beyond anything the Goa'uld had ever possessed. And he wanted it. Jacob Carter, Selmak's host, Sam's father, and one of the most capable intelligence operatives the Tok'ra had ever produced, laid the situation out with the directness that had made him a colonel before he ever became a symbiote host. Anubis isn't just interested in the rifts, George. He's interested in the man who closed one. His scouts detected the energy spike on P3X-774 when the rift sealed. They traced it back to Earth within 6 hours. He knows something came through your gate. He knows it's powerful, and he's already moving assets into position. Hammond absorbed this. How long before he acts? Days, maybe less. Anubis doesn't telegraph. He positions, and then he strikes, and by the time you know he's moved, he's already 3 steps ahead. Jacob paused. You need to understand what you're dealing with here, George. This isn't Apophis throwing a tantrum. Anubis is the smartest, most ruthless System Lord in the galaxy, and he just discovered something that might make him unstoppable. He will come for it. The only question is how. The briefing that followed included SG-1 in full, plus Daniel, who had been working with the Tok'ra intelligence data on the energy signatures and had developed a theory that no one wanted to hear, but everyone needed to. The rifts aren't random, Daniel said, pulling up a star chart on the display screen. 14 points of light, scattered across the gate network like a constellation no one had mapped. I cross-referenced the locations with ancient databases we have on file. Every single one of these worlds has a connection to ancient activity. Old outposts, abandoned research sites, places where the ancients were studying dimensional theory millennia before they ascended. He turned to face the room. Someone opened these rifts deliberately. Not the demons. They're coming through them, but they didn't create them. Someone, or something, punched holes between dimensions on worlds the ancients cared about. The silence that followed was the kind that SGC had learned to be afraid of. The kind that meant the problem was bigger than anyone had initially understood. O'Neill looked down the table at the Doomslayer, who had been sitting in his usual position. End of the table, armor humming faintly, helmet angled toward whoever was speaking with the attentiveness of someone who understood every word and chose to respond to none of them. Hey, you hearing all this? The helmet turned toward O'Neill. Somebody opened those rifts on purpose. Someone connected to the ancients. That ring a bell? Any bells at all? The Doomslayer was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table. Slowly, deliberately, the way someone handles a situation where sudden movement might be misinterpreted, and placed one gauntleted finger on the star chart. On a single point. A world that Daniel had flagged but not yet analyzed. He tapped it twice. Carter leaned forward to read the address. Her face changed. O'Neill saw it happen. The shift from curiosity to something sharper. Something that made her straighten in her chair and look at Hammond with the expression she wore when a piece of data had just rearranged everything she thought she knew. Sir, she said, That's P4X-891. We've never been there, but it's in the ancient database. I flagged as... She paused, double-checking. Flagged as a location of significant research. The notation is incomplete, but the translation reads, Origin Point. Hammond looked at the Doomslayer. The Slayer looked back. The gate hummed somewhere below them, connecting thousands of worlds, and somewhere in the dark between stars, a half-ascended god was already moving his fleet. The Tok'ra wanted to study him. This was not a surprise. The Tok'ra wanted to study everything. Every new technology, every anomalous energy source, every weapon that might tip the balance against the System Lords. It was how they survived. They were spies first, scientists second, and warriors when they had to be. But the thread running through all of it was information. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered when you were outnumbered by an empire that spanned a galaxy. Selmak made the request through Jacob, who made it to Hammond, who brought it to O'Neill, who brought it to the team. The conversation happened in the SGC mess hall at 0600 over coffee that Carter had long since stopped tasting and eggs that O'Neill was pushing around his plate with the particular expression that meant he was already composing an argument. They want access to his energy readings, Jacob said, settling into the chair across from O'Neill with the ease of a man who had spent decades navigating military briefings, first as a colonel, now as something considerably more complicated. Non-invasive, sensor sweeps. Carter's already got half the data they're asking for. They want the rest. Specifically, they want to understand the glory kill mechanism, the way he absorbs energy from the entities he fights. If we can replicate that, even partially, it changes the equation against Anubis entirely. O'Neill looked at Carter. Carter looked at her coffee. It's not unreasonable, Jack, she said, and the fact that she used his first name told him she was thinking carefully about her next words. The energy absorption is the key to everything. How he heals, how he sustains, how he closed that rift. If the Tok'ra can analyze the mechanism without interfering with it, the intelligence value alone is huge, O'Neill finished. He set his fork down. And the part where we hand Tok'ra scientists access to our newest and most unpredictable asset? Is a gamble, Jacob acknowledged. But it's a gamble that might be the only way to stay ahead of Anubis. Selmak's people have been running operations against him for decades. They know his patterns. They know his fleet movements. If we give them something useful in return, real, actionable intelligence about how to fight what's coming through those rifts, they'll share everything they have on his current position and strategy. The conversation might have ended there, a clean exchange of intelligence and cooperation, if Daniel hadn't been listening from 3 tables away and hadn't walked over with his coffee, and the expression he wore when he was about to say something that made everyone uncomfortable precisely because it needed to be said. Has anyone actually asked him? The table went quiet. O'Neill looked up. Asked who what? The Doomslayer. Has anyone asked him whether he's willing to be studied? Daniel sat down, wrapping both hands around his mug. We've been making decisions about him. Where he goes, what he does, who gets access to his data, without once sitting down and having a conversation about what he wants. I know he doesn't talk much. I know he's not exactly a diplomat. But he's a person, Jack. He walked through our gate. He fought a war on one of our worlds. And we're sitting here negotiating his value like he's a piece of technology we found in an ancient outpost. The silence that followed was the kind that made O'Neill set his jaw and look at the table for a long moment before answering. Because Daniel was right. Daniel was almost always right about the things that mattered. The human things. The things that didn't show up on tactical assessments or mission briefings. It was what made him the best archaeologist the SGC had ever had. And it was what made him occasionally deeply inconvenient. All right, O'Neill said. Someone talks to him. That someone turned out to be Teal'c. The choice was not accidental. Carter suggested it during the planning discussion, and O'Neill agreed immediately, because when it came to understanding warriors who communicated in actions rather than words, there was no one in Stargate Command better equipped than the Jaffa, who had defected from Apophis's army and spent every day since proving that loyalty could be earned rather than demanded. Teal'c found the Doomslayer in the SGC training room at 2,200 hours. The facility was empty. Most of the base was on night shift rotation. Skeleton crew in the control room. Minimal personnel in the corridors. The training room was large, industrial, designed for close-quarters combat drills and weapons qualification. The Doomslayer was not training. He was standing in the center of the room, perfectly still, the way a blade rests in its sheath. Waiting. Teal'c entered without announcement. He carried no weapon. He wore his standard uniform, the symbiote pouch beneath his shirt, a secret he had long since stopped hiding from those who mattered. He crossed the room and stopped 6 feet from the Slayer, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to respect the space that every warrior needed around them. "I am Teal'c," he said. "I was once a Jaffa, a warrior in the service of the Goa'uld. I believed them to be gods." A pause. Waited. Deliberate. "I was wrong. I have spent many years fighting to free my people from that belief." The Doomslayer's helmet turned toward him. Listening. "The Takra wish to study you," Teal'c continued. "Colonel O'Neill and Major Carter have been asked to facilitate this. They have not yet agreed because they recognize that you have not been consulted." Another pause. Teal'c's voice carried the particular gravity of someone choosing each word with the precision of a marksman. "I have come to ask you directly. Not because protocol requires it, because you are a warrior and warriors deserve to be asked." The training room held its silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere deep in the mountain, the gate sat dormant, waiting for the next chevron to lock. The Doomslayer moved. Not toward Teal'c, toward the far wall, where a tactical display screen had been left active. He studied it for a moment, then turned back and pointed. At the screen. At the star chart still displayed from the earlier briefing. At P4X-891. At the origin point. Then he pointed at himself. At his chest, where the Praetor suit's energy core pulsed with its faint, living light. Then he pointed at Teal'c. The message was clear, even without words, even without translation. "I will give you what you need. But we go there first, together." Teal'c regarded the Doomslayer for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, a gesture of respect that he reserved for very few people in his life. "Indeed," he said, "Chulak had not been kind to the rebellion. The Free Jaffa movement had been growing for years, fed by Teal'c's defection, sustained by Bratak's stubborn, battle-hardened leadership, and kept alive by the quiet, dangerous hope that thousands of Jaffa warriors carried in their chests alongside the symbiote larvae that had enslaved their people for generations. But hope was a fragile thing on a world where Apophis's legacy still cast its shadow, where the memory of false gods was burned into the culture so deeply that questioning it felt like cutting out a piece of your own soul. The rebellion was growing. It was also bleeding. Anubis had not moved against Earth. Not yet. The intelligence from the Takra confirmed what Jacob had warned. The half-ascended System Lord was patient when patience served him. He was positioning, consolidating, on pulling resources from across the galaxy into a configuration that Carter's models suggested was designed for a single, decisive strike. The kind of operation that Anubis specialized in. One move. One blow. And then it was over. But while he waited, he sent a message. The message arrived on Chulak 3 days before SG-1 did, delivered not through words or transmissions but through action. A squad of Anubis's super soldiers, the enhanced warriors that represented the System Lord's most dangerous military innovation, descended on a Jaffa rebel outpost on the planet's northern continent. The outpost housed 47 warriors, 12 civilians, and a cache of weapons that the rebellion had been stockpiling for months. When SG-1 and the Doomslayer arrived through the gate 2 days later, the outpost was ash. Bratak met them at the gate with 30 warriors at his back and fury in his eyes. The old Jaffa master was scarred in ways that told stories spanning decades of warfare, a face that had looked at the Goa'uld and refused to flinch long before it was safe to do so. He clasped Teal'c's forearm in the warrior's greeting, exchanged words in rapid Goa'uld that O'Neill couldn't follow, and then turned his attention to the armored figure standing at the edge of the group. Bratak studied the Doomslayer the way a general studies a battlefield, quickly, completely, cataloging every variable. Then he looked at Teal'c and said something short and sharp in Goa'uld. Teal'c's expression didn't change, But O'Neill caught the faintest flicker of something that might have been amusement at the corner of his jaw. "What did he say?" O'Neill asked. "See, he said the stranger carries the weight of war like it is a coat he has never taken off," Teal'c translated, "and that he has not seen such a thing since he was young." The tactical situation on Chulak was worse than the briefings had suggested. Anubis's super soldiers had hit 3 rebel outposts in 48 hours. The destruction was precise, surgical, not the kind of overkill that characterized most Goa'uld military operations, but the kind of calculated message that said, "I can reach you anywhere, and I want you to know it." The rebellion was fracturing. Some Jaffa were calling for retreat, pulling back to remote worlds, regrouping, waiting for a better moment. Others were calling for an immediate counterattack, which Bratak and Teal'c both knew would be exactly what Anubis wanted. O'Neill sat down with Bratak and Teal'c in the rebel command tent, a structure built into the root system of one of Chulak's ancient trees, hidden from orbital scans by terrain and by the particular kind of ingenuity that people developed when their survival depended on it. Carter spread her tactical displays across a flat stone and began mapping Anubis's strike patterns. Daniel worked with 2 Jaffa translators to piece together the intelligence from the surviving outposts. The picture that emerged was not encouraging. Anubis was drawing the rebellion into the open, forcing them to respond, and then hitting them where they gathered. It was a trap. Everyone in the tent knew it was a trap. The question was whether to spring it on their terms or let Anubis set the timing. The Doomslayer made the decision for them. He had been standing at the edge of the command area, silent as always, helmet angled toward the tactical displays with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When O'Neill finished laying out the options, retreat, counterattack, or hold position and wait, the Slayer moved to the display. He studied the map for exactly 4 seconds. Then he placed his gauntleted hand on a point 30 kilometers north of their position, the site of the largest destroyed outpost, the one where Anubis's super soldiers had made the most visible statement. He tapped it. Then he looked at Bratak. The old Jaffa master understood immediately. His eyes narrowed, and something shifted in his expression, something that moved from fury to calculation to something harder and older. Purpose. "He wants to go back," Bratak said, in Goa'uld. Yes, and Teal'c translated. "To the destroyed outpost?" O'Neill asked. "Why?" "Because Anubis expects us to avoid it," Teal'c said. "It is the one place the System Lord believes we will not return to. The message was designed to frighten us away from it." A pause. "The Doomslayer does not frighten." The operation was improvised, brutal, and beautiful in the way that Stargate missions sometimes were when the people running them had stopped following the playbook and started trusting each other. Bratak led 40 Jaffa warriors through the jungle in a wide arc, approaching the destroyed outpost from the east. The direction Anubis's scouts would not be watching, because no sane military commander would approach from that angle on terrain this hostile. Carter ran electronic countermeasures from a portable ancient device that Daniel had found in one of the surviving rebel caches, masking their energy signatures from orbital surveillance. O'Neill took point with a P-90 and the particular brand of controlled aggression that had made him one of the most dangerous soldiers in the United States military. Teal'c fought beside the Doomslayer. It was not planned. It happened naturally, the way things happened when 2 warriors understood each other without words. The Jaffa and the man from Hell moved through the jungle together, and the Jaffa rebels who watched them fight did so with the kind of wide-eyed, silent attention that warriors reserved for moments that would become stories. Or Teal'c's staff weapon and Zat worked in concert with the Doomslayer's arsenal, covering each other's blind spots, anticipating each other's movements, operating as a unit in the way that only soldiers who had stopped thinking about coordination and started simply doing it could achieve. Anubis's super soldiers were waiting at the outpost, 12 of them, positioned in a loose perimeter, a tripwire designed to trigger an alarm and call down orbital bombardment the moment the rebels showed themselves. It was a good plan. It would have worked against anyone else. The Doomslayer went through them in under 2 minutes. Bratak watched from the tree line as the last super soldier fell. These enhanced warriors that had terrorized the rebellion for months. That had made Jaffa veterans afraid to sleep. And the old master's face carried an expression that O'Neill had never seen on him before. Not fear, Not surprise. Something quieter. Something that looked, in the red-tinged light of Chulak's twin suns setting through the jungle canopy, like the first stirring of real hope. The orbital strike never came. Carter's countermeasures held. The rebellion had taken back the outpost, destroyed Anubis's tripwire, and sent a message of their own. One that every Jaffa on Chulak would hear before the night was over. Bratak turned to Teal'c, and then to the Doomslayer, and said something in Goa'uld that made Teal'c's eyebrows rise a fraction of an inch. "What?" O'Neill asked. "He says the stranger fights like someone the gods themselves would run from," Teal'c said. "Meow, and that the rebellion could use more men like him." The Doomslayer said nothing. But he turned his helmet toward Bratak, and something in the way he held himself, shoulders settling, stance relaxing by a degree that O'Neill had never seen from him, suggested that for the first time since arriving in the Stargate universe, he had found something that felt familiar. A war worth fighting. And warriors worth fighting beside. Anubis's mothership hung in orbit above a dead world like a cathedral built for cruelty. The intelligence from the Tok'ra had been precise. Selmak's network had tracked the System Lord's flagship to a system 3 days hyperspace travel from Earth, orbiting a planet the ancients had once used as a research station and that Anubis had claimed centuries ago as a staging ground. The ship was a Hatak, modified beyond standard Goa'uld specifications in ways that Carter spent the entire transit analyzing and came up short on. The modifications drew on ancient knowledge, Anubis's particular talent, the thing that made him different from every other System Lord. He didn't just use technology, he understood it, the way the ancients had understood it. And that understanding had given him a ship that was faster, better shielded, and more heavily armed than anything else in the Goa'uld fleet. Getting aboard was Carter's problem. Getting to Anubis was O'Neill's. Staying alive long enough to do either was everyone's. The plan was built on layers, each one designed to fail gracefully if the one beneath it collapsed. Jacob Carter and Selmak provided the outermost layer. Tok'ra intelligence on the ship's patrol rotations, sensor blind spots, and the communication frequencies Anubis's Jaffa used during shift changes. Carter provided the next layer, a modified cloaking device, reverse-engineered from Goa'uld technology and ancient fragments, that would mask a Teltok cargo ship long enough to dock in one of the Hatak's secondary hangars during a window when sensor coverage was at its thinnest. Daniel provided translation and cultural intelligence, the codes, protocols, and behavioral patterns that would let them move through a Goa'uld ship without immediately drawing attention. Teal'c provided the knowledge that only a former first prime of Apophis could provide, the way a Hatak felt from the inside, the rhythms of it, the way fear and power breathed through its corridors like atmosphere through a living thing. The Doomslayer provided the violence. O'Neill briefed the insertion in the Teltak's cargo hold 3 hours before they reached Anubis's system. The team was small: O'Neill, Carter, Daniel, Teal'c, and the Slayer. Jacob stayed with the ship, running communications and ready to extract them if extraction became possible. The briefing was shorter than usual. O'Neill had learned over years of impossible missions that the best plans were the ones simple enough to survive contact with reality. We get aboard. We find Anubis. We end this. He looked at each of them in turn. Carter, you keep the extraction route open. Daniel, you keep us from walking into something stupid we don't understand. Teal'c, you keep us moving. And you, he turned to the Doomslayer, you do what you do. The helmet tilted, the faintest suggestion of acknowledgement. The Hatak's secondary hangar was dark, industrial, and smelling of ozone and recycled air. The Teltok docked with a shudder that Carter masked with a sensor pulse timed to coincide with a routine systems check. They moved out in a tight formation, O'Neill on point, Teal'c covering the rear, Carter tracking their position on a modified handheld scanner, Daniel watching the corridors with the particular alertness of someone who had learned the hard way that Goa'uld ships were never as empty as they appeared. They encountered the first Jaffa patrol 40 meters in. Teal'c neutralized them before O'Neill gave the order. 3 warriors, down and silent in under 5 seconds. The Jaffa master moving with a speed and precision that still, after all these years, made O'Neill grateful they were on the same side. The bodies were dragged into a maintenance alcove. The patrol's communication device was taken. Carter reprogrammed it in 90 seconds flat, syncing it to Anubis's internal frequencies. They moved deeper. The Hatak's interior architecture was familiar to Teal'c's, the same oppressive geometry that all Goa'uld motherships shared. Corridors angled to create psychological dominance, everything designed to make the occupants feel small and watched. But Anubis's modifications changed the texture of it. The walls carried a faint luminescence that pulsed in rhythms that didn't match any standard Goa'uld power cycle. Ancient technology, integrated into the ship's systems at a level that suggested years of careful, methodical work. Carter's scanner picked up energy signatures that made her frown and mutter calculations under her breath. "He's rewriting the ship," she whispered to O'Neill as they paused at a junction. "Using ancient power configurations, the shield harmonics alone. Jack, this ship could survive a direct hit from an orbital bombardment platform." "Good to know," O'Neill whispered back. Anything that helps us get off this ship?" "Working on it." They found the throne room on the Hatak's command level, a vast vaulted space that Anubis had transformed from a standard Goa'uld command center into something that looked like a cathedral crossed with a war room. Ancient symbols lined the walls, interwoven with Goa'uld script in patterns that Daniel stopped to study and then deliberately looked away from, his face carrying the expression of someone who had just read something he wished he hadn't. At the center of the room, elevated on a platform of dark stone, sat a throne. And on the throne sat Anubis. The System Lord was partially masked, his face obscured by the same dark cowl he always wore, the one that hid the damage his partial ascension had done to his physical form. But his eyes were visible. Ancient eyes, carrying knowledge that no Goa'uld should have possessed, burning with an intelligence that was colder and more patient than anything the team had faced before. He was not surprised to see them. He had been waiting. "Tauri," Anubis said. His voice carried the layered resonance of a Goa'uld symbiote, two beings speaking simultaneously, one ancient parasite and one host whose identity had been consumed so thoroughly that nothing of the original person remained. "You have brought something interesting to my galaxy. I am curious." His gaze moved past O'Neill, past Carter, past Daniel and Teal'c, and settled on the Doomslayer. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Not physically. Carter's scanner registered no change in atmospheric conditions. But something shifted in the space between the two beings. Something that O'Neill, who had spent decades reading rooms and people and the invisible dynamics of power, recognized immediately as two predators assessing each other for the first time. Anubis leaned forward on his throne. The ancient symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, responding to his attention, responding to the half-ascended energy that radiated from him like heat from a star. "I have touched the higher planes," he said, his layered voice carrying something that sounded almost like hunger. "I have seen what exists beyond the physical. I have looked into the void between dimensions and taken knowledge from it." A pause. "And yet you carry something I do not recognize. Something older than the ancients. Something that does not belong in this reality at all." The Doomslayer said nothing. He stood at the edge of the platform, the crucible held loosely at his side, and regarded the half-ascended god with the same flat, unreadable attention he brought to everything. O'Neill watched the exchange and felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, a realization that settled into place with the quiet certainty of a chevron locking. Anubis was afraid, not visibly, not in any way that a lesser observer would have caught. But O'Neill had been reading people his entire career, and he knew what fear looked like in someone who had never experienced it before. It looked like curiosity. It looked like hunger. It looked like a man on a throne leaning forward because he needed to understand the thing in front of him before it could touch him. Anubis raised his hand. The Karakesh on his palm flared with Naquata energy. The ribbon device, amplified by ancient modifications, crackling with a power that could shatter stone and flesh alike. A warning. A demonstration. "I am a god. Remember that." The Doomslayer looked at the Karakesh, looked at Anubis, and tilted his helmet forward, just slightly, in a gesture that O'Neill had come to recognize over weeks of watching this man fight. It was not fear. It was not respect. It was the look he wore right before he killed something. The Karakesh fired. The blast hit the Doomslayer square in the chest and did something that no one in the room expected. It detonated against the Praetor suit's energy core and reflected. Not perfectly, not like a mirror bouncing light. More like a collision. The Naquata energy and the hell-forged power source struck each other, and the resulting shockwave blew outward in a sphere that cracked the ancient stone beneath the Slayer's boots and sent O'Neill and Teal'c sliding backward across the throne room floor. Carter caught herself on a pillar, scanner still clutched in her hand, eyes wide. Not with fear, but with the raw, electric focus of a scientist watching something that had never happened before happen in real time. Anubis was on his feet. For the first time in the encounter, the System Lord moved with something other than calculated composure. He descended from his throne in 2 steps, the cowl falling back slightly to reveal more of the damaged face beneath. The price of partial ascension, the cost of reaching for godhood and being pulled back before the process completed. His eyes burned with ancient light, and the symbols on the walls blazed in response, the entire ship seeming to lean toward its master as though the Hatak itself understood that something fundamental was being challenged. "What are you?" Anubis's voice carried a rawness that Goa'uld voices never carried. The symbiote's layered resonance faltered. 2 beings, host and parasite, both uncertain for the first time. The Doomslayer answered by closing the distance between them. For he moved like something the laws of physics had agreed to accommodate rather than constrain. Across the throne room floor in 3 strides, the crucible rising in an arc that sang through the air with a sound like the world tearing open. Anubis raised both hands, Karakesh and a second device, ancient in design, that Carter would later identify as a modified energy shield generator, and the air between them erupted in light. O'Neill fired. P-90, full automatic, the round striking Anubis's shields and dissolving into nothing. Useless. He knew it was useless. He fired anyway because that was what you did when someone you were fighting alongside was in danger, even if the someone was a silent, armored force of nature who probably didn't need the help. Teal'c moved. Not toward Anubis, toward the throne room's secondary console, a Goa'uld command interface that he knew better than most people knew their own homes. His fingers flew across the crystalline surface, pulling up ship systems with the speed of long practice. "I can disable the shield emitters," he said, not looking up, his voice carrying the calm that Teal'c brought to impossible situations like breathing. "But it will take time." "How much time?" O'Neill asked. "More than we have." The Doomslayer did not need the shields disabled. What happened next was not a fight in any conventional sense. It was not 2 combatants exchanging blows in the tactical dance that O'Neill had seen 1,000 times across 100 worlds. It was an assault, a demolition. The Doomslayer pressed into Anubis's shields with a force that made the energy barriers flicker and distort, undriving the half-ascended System Lord backward across his own throne room, and with each step, the crucible found a new angle, a new weakness. Anubis's shields were powerful, ancient enhanced, Naquata amplified, designed to withstand orbital bombardment. They were not designed to withstand something that drew its power from a dimension older than the universe itself. The first shield layer collapsed at 17 seconds. Anubis stumbled. The cowl fell back further, revealing the full extent of the damage that partial ascension had wrought. A face that was more energy than flesh, flickering between physical and ethereal states as the symbiote inside him fought to maintain cohesion. He raised the Karakesh again, channeling everything he had into a single focused blast that should have vaporized anything biological. The Doomslayer walked through it, not unscathed. The blast burned. O'Neill could see the scorch marks appearing on the Praetor suit's surface, could see the energy core flickering under the strain, but the Slayer kept moving, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done, in hell and in every dimension that hell had ever touched. He kept moving. Forward. Into the thing that was trying to kill him. Because stopping was not something the Doomslayer knew how to do. The second shield layer collapsed at 29 seconds. And then O'Neill heard something he had never expected to hear in a Goa'uld throne room. Daniel's voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the chaos from where the archaeologist had been studying the ancient symbols on the walls. "Jack, the rifts are connected to this ship." O'Neill's head snapped toward Daniel. The archaeologist was pointing at a section of the wall where the ancient script had begun to glow with the same red luminescence that Carter had documented on P3X-774. The same biological frequency. The same dimensional bleed. O'Neill's mind made the connection before Daniel finished explaining it, because O'Neill's mind was faster than people gave it credit for, especially when lives depended on it. Anubis hadn't just detected the rifts. He had opened them. The origin point that the Doomslayer had identified, P4X-891, was the source, but Anubis had been amplifying the rifts, feeding them, using the dimensional energy as a power source for his modified systems. The hell bleed across the gate network wasn't a side effect of the Slayer's arrival, and it was Anubis's weapon, his ace. A source of power that predated the Ancients, that even the Ascended couldn't fully control, and that he had been carefully, patiently cultivating for months. Carter's voice came through O'Neill's earpiece, tight with urgency. "Sir, if he's using the rift energy as a power source for the ship's systems, and we destroy him without severing the connection, the rifts stay open," O'Neill finished. "Worse, without him controlling them, they destabilize. All 14 of them. Simultaneously. The dimensional bleed would be catastrophic. Every gate-connected world in range could be affected." O'Neill looked at the Doomslayer. The Slayer was 6 feet from Anubis now, the last shield layer crackling and failing. The crucible raised for the killing blow that O'Neill knew, with absolute certainty, was coming. On the blow that would end Anubis, end the threat, end the System Lord who had dared to reach for godhood and come closer than any Goa'uld in history. But it would not end the rifts. "Hey!" O'Neill shouted. The Doomslayer's helmet turned. A fraction of a second. A pause in the forward momentum that cost him nothing tactically, but gave O'Neill the opening he needed. The Colonel pointed at the wall, at the red glow, at the ancient symbols that Daniel was frantically translating, pulling up the interface that controlled the rift connections on a secondary console. O'Neill held up 2 fingers, then pointed at Anubis, then at the glowing wall, then closed his fist, the universal gesture for shut it down. The choice. O'Neill saw it happen. Saw the helmet turn back to Anubis. The killing blow right there. The end of the half-ascended god hanging in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Saw the crucible tremble with the force of the power coursing through it. Saw the Doomslayer, who had fought hell itself, who had destroyed demons beyond counting, who had never once in his existence chosen anything other than the kill. Pause. Not hesitate. The Doomslayer did not hesitate. He calculated. In the space of a single second, he weighed the thing he had been working toward since before he ever stepped through Earth's gate against the thing O'Neill was asking him to do. The kill against the gate network. Anubis against 14 worlds. His war against theirs. He chose theirs. The crucible moved, not toward Anubis's throat, but toward the wall. Toward the ancient interface that connected the Hatak systems to the Rift network. The blade struck the crystalline control matrix with a force that shattered it completely, the hell-forged edge cutting through ancient technology like it was glass. The red glow on the walls died instantly. The rifts, all 14 of them across the gate network, collapsed simultaneously. Carter confirmed it 3 seconds later through a burst transmission from Jacob, who was monitoring from the Teltalk. Sealed. All of them. Gone. Anubis screamed. It was not a human sound. It was not even a Goa'uld sound. It was the sound of something that had touched the higher planes of existence and felt the power it had been drawing on vanish in an instant. A sound of rage and loss and the particular fury of a being who had built everything on a foundation that someone had just pulled out from under him. The half-ascended light that burned in his eyes flickered, destabilized, and for one terrible moment, O'Neill saw what Anubis actually was beneath the cowl and the power and the millennia of scheming. A parasite in a broken body, clinging to godhood by fingernails and losing his grip. The Doomslayer turned back to him. The crucible rose one final time. The Hatak systems went dark 3 seconds after Anubis fell. Not catastrophically. Not the kind of cascading failure that turned a mothership into a tomb. Carter had been working the ship's secondary consoles from the moment they boarded, mapping power systems and fail-safes with the methodical intensity she brought to every problem. When the ancient interface shattered and the rift energy vanished, the ship's power core destabilized, but Carter's countermeasures kicked in. Automated rerouting protocols she had programmed into the system during the insertion. Insurance against exactly this kind of moment. The lights flickered. The floor hummed with reduced power. Emergency strips along the corridor ceilings activated, casting everything in a pale blue glow that made the throne room look like an underwater cathedral. Anubis did not get up. O'Neill approached the fallen System Lord with his P90 up, out of habit more than necessity. The half-ascended light was gone from Anubis's eyes. The flickering between physical and ethereal states had stopped. What remained on the throne room floor was something that looked less like a god, and more like what it had always been. A parasite in a host body, ancient and cunning and ruthless, but mortal. Mortal in a way that Anubis had spent centuries trying to escape. The Crucible had seen to that. Whatever the hell-forged blade had done in those final seconds, whatever it meant for a being that had touched ascension to be cut by something that predated it, the result was absolute. Anubis was finished. O'Neill lowered his weapon and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Okay," he said, to no one in particular. That happened. Teal'c moved through the throne room with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent decades on gold ships and knew exactly how quickly things could change when a System Lord's authority evaporated. He checked the exits, confirmed the corridors were clear, and opened a channel to Jacob on the teltalk. "We need extraction, now." Jacob's voice came back immediately, sharp and professional. "Copy that. Bringing us in. Carter, I need you to hold the hangar doors open. My scans are showing Jaffa regrouping on the command level." "Already on it," Carter said, fingers moving across her scanner. She paused, glanced at the Doomslayer, and then back at her screen with the particular expression she wore when Data was telling her something important. "Jacob, the rift readings. All 14. And confirmed sealed?" A beat of silence. Then, "Confirmed. Every single one." Whatever he did to that interface, it wasn't just a disruption. The rifts are closed. Permanently closed. The dimensional bleed is gone. Carter looked up at the Doomslayer. He was standing where he had stood when the Crucible struck. Perfectly still, the blade held loosely at his side, the Praetor suit's energy core pulsing with its quiet, living light. The scorch marks from Anubis's Karakesh were visible across his chest plate, but the suit was already repairing itself, the dark surface knitting together with a slow, organic fluidity that made Carter's scientific mind itch with questions she knew she might never get answers to. Daniel was still at the wall, studying the ancient script that remained visible even after the interface had shattered. His face carried the expression of deep concentration that meant he had found something worth understanding. "Jack," he said quietly, "this inscription. It's not just technical documentation, it's..." He paused, searching for the right word. "It's a warning. The ancients knew about hell. They documented it. They knew it existed as an adjacent dimension, and they knew what lived in it. And they wrote about it here, on this ship, because Anubis found their research and used it." "So Anubis wasn't just experimenting," O'Neill said. "He was reading the ancients' notes and following the recipe." "Exactly. And the ancients' notes include something else." Daniel turned from the wall, his expression shifting from scholarly focus to something more urgent. "Coordinates. A location they marked as critical to understanding the hell dimension's interaction with our own. It's not one of the 14 rift points. It's somewhere else entirely." The extraction happened fast and clean. Jacob brought the teltalk in through the hangar, while Teal'c and O'Neill held the corridor against a disorganized Jaffa response that never quite coalesced into a real threat. Anubis's death had hit his forces like a severed nerve, and the resulting chaos gave SG-1 the window they needed to get back aboard and push for the stars. The Hatak, leaderless and destabilized, would not pursue. Jacob's assessment was blunt. Anubis's Jaffa are going to tear each other apart fighting over what's left. We don't need to do anything except not be there when it happens. The teltalk cleared the Hatak sensor range in 11 minutes. Or Jacob punched the hyperdrive, and the stars stretched into lines, and the silence of FTL travel settled over the ship like a held breath finally released. O'Neill sat in the cargo hold, back against a bulkhead, P90 across his knees, and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Beside him, Teal'c sat with the stillness of deep meditation, though his eyes were open and watching the Doomslayer, who stood near the cargo ramp with his helmet angled toward the stars, visible through the Teltax viewport. Carter was running numbers. She was always running numbers. But she paused, looked up at the Doomslayer, and said something that O'Neill had heard her say before, in moments like this. Moments when the impossible had just become possible, and the universe had rearranged itself around people who refused to accept that it couldn't. Thank you. The Doomslayer turned his helmet toward her, held it there for a moment. Then, in a gesture that O'Neill would remember for years, a gesture so small and so human that it almost got lost in everything else, he inclined his head. A nod. Just one. But it carried the weight of something that had never existed before in the Stargate universe. Acknowledgement, from a warrior who had fought alone for longer than civilizations had risen and fallen, that he had not fought alone this time. The debriefing at Cheyenne Mountain took 2 days. Hammond listened to every word, asked every question, and made decisions with the calm authority that had kept SGC functioning through threats that would have broken lesser commanders. The Tok'ra received a full intelligence briefing on Anubis's modified systems and the ancient research he had exploited. The Jaffa Rebellion, Bratak's people on Chulak and free Jaffa cells across a dozen worlds, received word of Anubis's fall through channels that spread faster than any official communication could. The ripple effect began immediately. System Lords who had feared Anubis for decades suddenly found the galactic balance shifting beneath their feet. Hammond sat across from the Doomslayer in his office on the final evening. Just the two of them, the general's desk between them, the quiet hum of the mountain around them. Hammond had commanded Stargate Command through invasions, apocalypses, and moments that had no name in any language. He had seen warriors of every kind pass through his gate room, but he had never seen one like this. "You made a choice up there," Hammond said. His voice was quiet, respectful, carrying none of the command authority he wore like a uniform in briefings. This was something older. One soldier recognizing another. "You could have killed him and ended it. Instead, you chose to seal the rifts. You chose to protect the network. You chose..." He paused. "You chose us." The Doomslayer sat in the chair across from the general's desk, the same chair that hundreds of soldiers had sat in before him, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his helmet toward the window behind Hammond's desk. The window looked out onto nothing. They were 28 levels underground, deep in the Colorado mountains. But somewhere below them, the Stargate sat in its chamber, dormant and waiting. I connected to thousands of worlds across 2 galaxies and beyond. "More rifts will open," the Doomslayer said. His voice was rough, certain, carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern repeat across dimensions and lifetimes. "Hell does not stop," Hammond nodded slowly. "Then I suppose we'd better make sure you're around when they do." The gate room was quiet that night. The chevrons dark, the event horizon still, the iris closed against the void. But in the control room, Carter sat alone at her console, scrolling through the data from the Hatak, from Daniel's translation of the ancient inscription, from the coordinates that pointed toward something none of them had yet visited. A location the ancients had deemed critical, and a place that might hold answers about the dimension that had bled into their galaxy, and the man who had carried its war through their gate. She pulled up the address. 7 symbols. A point of origin. A door that had never been opened. Somewhere in the mountain, the Doomslayer stood in the training room, the crucible resting against his shoulder, and waited. Not patiently. Not submissively. The way he always waited. Ready, certain, and pointed toward the next fight that was already coming. Carter began to dial. Hammond's weekly mission report, filed on a Tuesday morning, included one entry that would remain in SGC's records for decades. It was short. It contained no tactical analysis, no threat assessment, no political implications. It simply read, "The Doomslayer remains on assignment. Hell does not stop. Neither do we. and in the gate room below, a chevron locked. Then another. The kawoosh of the wormhole filled the chamber with its ancient, impossible light, the sound and shimmer that had defined Earth's survival among the stars for years. And somewhere on the other side of that connection, a world the ancients had marked as an origin point waited to be explored by a team that had just learned something no Stargate mission had ever taught them before. That sometimes, the greatest battles were not won by the strongest fighter. They were won by the strongest team. Indeed, more stories await.